This video contains major spoilers for Dark Souls 1 and 3, as well as Bloodborne, so if you don't have enough insight yet, consider this your frenzy warning.
Perhaps you've seen it. Maybe in a dream. A murky, forgotten land. A place where souls may mend your ailing mind. You will lose everything. Once branded. The symbol of the curse. An augur of darkness. Your past, your future, your very light. None will have meaning, and you won't even care. By then, you'll be something other than human. A thing that feeds on souls, a hollow.
We generally concur that men, such as a cow, a turkey, a frog, and a fish, all possess some spark of consciousness, some kind of primitive soul, but by God it's a good deal smaller than ours is. And that, no more or no less, is why we men feel that we have the perfect right to extinguish their dim lights in the head of these fractionally souled beasts, and to gobble down their once warm and wiggling, now chilled and stilled protoplasm with limitless gusto, and to feel not a trace of guilt while doing so. The world of Dark Souls is missing food. Normally this doesn't seem like that big of a deal. It's not particularly surprising that drinking Estus is the only thing that undead require for sustenance. But in these games, we're repeatedly shown the trappings of a formerly thriving agricultural system with no sign of the actual crops. The most obvious example of this are the ever-present scythes found throughout the series. And while you could write that off as an extended Grim Reaper reference, item descriptions hint that there's a lot more going on here than meets the eye. For instance, there's the great scythes of both Dark Souls 1 and 3, with the descriptions that they're, quote, normally used for crop harvesting. If we want to take that idea a step further semantically, a scythe used for the threshing of wheat is effectively a life-hunting scythe. These games also repeatedly feature the imagery of stables, but the stables are always empty, and when we stumble upon what might have been livestock, they're typically not looking so hot. And then we have one of the most blatant examples, Harvest Valley in Dark Souls 2. Despite its name and the giant windmill, it has been turned into a highly poisonous mining encampment. What may have been its former inhabitants can be found a few zones later in Brightstone Cove, Seldora. Here the inhabitants of the zone are wearing the peasant set, which is described as being more fit for farming than fighting. But they appear to have given up farming, as once again we only see signs of mining, with the possible exception of a weird rock garden near the bottom of the zone. So to explain what's going on here, let's start at the beginning in the Northern Undead Asylum of Dark Souls 1, cross-referenced with the late 90s manga Red River. After all, Miyazaki did cite girls' manga as an inspiration. Red River is a fictional story set in the historical context of the Hittite Empire, which was at its height around 1300 BC. The story begins with the protagonist teleported to HATTUSA, the capital of the empire. In modern times, one of the enduring ruins of HATTUSA is the Lion's Gate, which is an interesting find for me. I had recently been perplexed by this pair of statues next to the door leading to the Asylum Demon Boss Arena, and stumbling upon the ruins of HATTUSA gave me a potential explanation and led me down a further path of inquiry. I should mention here that they might also serve as foreshadowing for the optional fight against the twin sanctuary guardians of Ulasel, but that's getting ahead of myself. HATTUSA actually fell to ruin twice. The first time occurred around 1700 BC, when an invading king conquered it and burnt it to the ground. The conquering king left the inscribed curse, "Whoever after me becomes king and resettles HATTUSA, let the storm god of the sky strike him." Its second death was a gradual abandonment that began around 1200 BC, alongside the fall of the Hittite Empire as part of what is now called the Late Bronze Age collapse. What caused the Late Bronze Age collapse is still a matter of debate. Records from the time are sketchy on account of that whole civilizational collapse thing. But a theory proposed by some, including the Fall of Civilizations podcast, suggests that the volcanic eruption Hekla 3 in Iceland blocked out the sun and led to widespread climate change around the globe. Environmental evidence also suggests that this period was one of intense drought for the Mediterranean and the Middle East. So with that on our mind, let's do an environmental investigation of the world of Dark Souls, because, as I've harped on in the past, there are signs of drought everywhere. One example that I can't believe I missed until recently is just outside the undead parish of Dark Souls 1. Looking back at the bridge we used to sneak into the side entrance of the church, we can see that the wall has been destroyed by something, and that wooden bridge we used to cross is a makeshift patch job. As a result, the fountains of the parish have drained out somewhere into Darkroot Garden. And let me be firm here, this is not wild speculation. From an efficiency perspective, it would have been far easier to model this section as a solid wall. Therefore, the crack in the wood scaffolding must have been a deliberate design choice that meant something specific to the designer. On top of that, the idea of liquid flow dynamics shows up repeatedly throughout the game, with the most blatant being the dredging of New Londo runes. This tells us that the flow of water was very much something on the collective mind of the development team. Drought imagery is everywhere in these games. It can be seen in Lower Undead Burg, Blight Town, and even Ulasil. It crosses over to Bloodborne, first in the aqueducts of Central Yharnam, and then repeated in the Forbidden Woods, Hemwick Charnel Lane, and the Hypogean Jail. The Undead Settlement in Dark Souls 3 recreates the Undead Parish setup, which then gets repeated even more blatantly in the Ashina Reservoir of Sekiro. Moving on, I should hope that the Dark Souls parallel to the volcanic cloud coverage blocking out the sun should be, well, obvious. But as for the volcano itself, the most straightforward place to look is Lost Izalith. If the ritual known as the Bed of Chaos erupted unexpectedly, the result might have been a ceaseless discharge, with the predictable environmental after effects. But there's a much more subtle hint at volcanic activity lurking in the world design of Lordran. The video Dark Souls Locations in Real Life by Croby Cat points out that the architecture of Undead Parish is inspired by the ruins of the Church of San Juan in Mexico. This church is famous for being partially buried under volcanic ash. Perhaps this is merely a coincidence. Except, the Dark Souls 1 DesignWorks interview tells us the centipede demon of Izalith was originally located on the roof of the parish chapel where we now fight the Bell Gargoyles. And then there's the location of the old Iron King in Dark Souls 2. Hasn't it ever struck you as a bit odd that despite being called an Iron Keep and being full of metallurgy imagery, the surrounding scenery of the boss arena is a church sinking into lava? Since I mentioned the Bell Gargoyles, let's jump to another Bronze Age topic, the bronze itself. Because, as is mentioned in the interview, Miyazaki and the artist behind the gargoyles, Mai Harayama, spent a considerable amount of time discussing a great many things, like how to make the creature fit in, about its heavy, thick armor, and its level of technological advancement. Often considered to be a fairly forgettable boss from a lore perspective, one of the things that stands out about the Gargoyle Twins is that all of their weapon and armor drops are made out of bronze. So since we're comparing Undead Parish to the collapse of the Bronze Age, let's talk a bit about the technology so essential to the era that it now bears its name. Bronze was an essential component of both the arms of the major militaries of the Bronze Age, as well as many of the tools civilian society depended upon. It was a bit of a wonder material for them, but that power came with an Achilles heel. Bronze is an alloy made primarily of copper and tin. Sourcing copper was no problem, but tin was incredibly rare. As a result, the major Bronze Age civilizations were dependent on trade networks. Networks that became increasingly non-functional as drought and famine set in. At the same time, ironworking was coming into play as a competitor to bronze. Until the development of steel, iron was less than ideal as a medium for weaponsmithing. but with tin, and thus bronze increasingly out of reach, readily available shoddy iron weaponry was better than nothing. This potentially proved to level the playing field between the formerly well-stocked major trading empires of the region and their smaller, poorer rivals. For these upstarts, it was like those games where your starting location is copper-starved, but you hold off long enough to detect a gunpowder. On the other end of Undeadburg, opposite the Bell Gargoyles, we first encounter the Capra Demon. Another often overlooked boss, the most fascinating thing about the Capra Demon is again their weapon description. The Demon Great Machete is described as being cast iron, an inferior method for forging iron weaponry, but good enough that the Undeadburg that you're invading has run out of tin. As my killer source, a Wikipedia article, points out, Robert Drews argues for the appearance of massed infantry using newly developed weapons and armor, such as cast rather than forged spearheads and long swords, a revolutionizing cut-and-thrust weapon, and javelins. Such new weaponry in the hands of large numbers of running skirmishers who could swarm and cut down a chariot army would destabilize states that were based upon use of chariots by the ruling class. That would precipitate an abrupt social collapse as raiders began to conquer, loot, and burn cities. Tying things back to the Hittite Empire, one of the technologies they dabbled in near the end of their empire was ironworking. But instead of using smelted iron, they sourced their iron from meteorites, similar to the siderite mentioned in the item descriptions of the Burial Blade and the Blades of Mercy from Bloodborne. Returning now to the Capra Demon, the other noteworthy part of the Demon Great Machete description is how it is hooked. Being hooked suggests that the machete was not intended primarily for combat use, but was instead designed to serve as a hunter's gutting knife. This fits into the long tradition of weaponry in Soulsborne games being repurposed from the tools of an agrarian or hunter-gatherer society. A kind of repurposing you might see frequently during a famine, as the peasantry adapt to a suddenly much more violent world. Another example of this theme is the Butchers of the Depths. Similar to the Capra Demon, they appear to be wielding iron cookware. Their butcher's table is also one of the extremely rare examples of food in the Dark Souls universe, and it's heavily implied that the source of this meat is cannibalism. First, there's the pyromancer you rescue from the barrels in the nearby storehouse. There's also the reoccurring invader Man-Eater Mildred, whose Dark Souls 3 incarnation wields the butcher knife, which describes her as a woman who acquired a taste for human flesh, of which she took glee in partaking. This ties perfectly into the theme of the boss of the area, the Gaping Dragon. In the Design Works interview, the Gaping Dragon is described as a creature completely consumed with the desire to eat. So much so that it began to adapt, and the parts of its body it no longer used, such as its head, began to retrogress. It no longer eats with its mouth, but takes food directly into its body, but it had to change this way in order to survive. Aside from eating, it's lost any faculties it may have once possessed, and has to survive in this desolate, harsh environment by eating anything it can. It simply did what it had to continue to exist. That theme of feeding gets repeated again one layer lower in Blighttown, where we encounter Quelaag. Once we put on the old witch's ring and talk to the fair lady, we find out that Quelaag has been the only one watching over her sister.
Oh, my dear sister, don't mind me. It does not hurt terribly. Your visit's out more than anything. I'll be fine. I have you, dear sister, but promise me that you will take care of yourself. Please, sister, do not cry. I am happy, really. I have you, don't I?
At this point, we can join the Chaos Servants Covenant and effectively become the surrogate for Quelaag. This provides us with the option to feed the fair lady humanity, with increasingly positive results.
Oh, thank you, Quelaag. It feels wonderful. It really helps, it does. Thank you. Dear sister, it hurts no longer. My dear sister, you know, I still remember your beautiful, silky face. If only I could gaze upon it once more. Goodbye, Quelaag. It was so very nice to chat.
The one thing I love to do in my approach to Soulsborne lore is to break out the transposition kiln. If we see a theme of hunger and feeding repeating over and over again in one particular game for no particularly obvious reason, then we should look for similar sections in the other games where we can insert this theme and test out how it harmonizes with the known narrative. Consider Gehrman. Why is he a prisoner in the hunter's dream?
Oh, Lawrence, Master Willem, somebody help me, unshackle me, please.
Well, maybe it's the same reason that Father Ariandal is shackled in the basement of the Painted World Cathedral.
Surely you've seen the rot that afflicts our world, but that which fooled the good father and buried the flame.
That just like Ariandal, Gehrman has been bewitched. And furthermore, just like Quelaag, Gehrman is feeding the moon presence in order to keep her alive, to help her continue to exist in this desolate, harsh environment. When you choose to surrender to him, he's not executing you. He's harvesting you with his life hunt scythe, absorbing the accumulated blood echoes of your hunt to serve as an offering to his captivating goddess. And to take it a step further, he's doing all this under the delusion that her child can still be brought to term. This hunter's dream that Akawet isn't just an omelette. You see, the wet nurse in Murgo's Wet Nurse is a bit of a euphemism. She's not Murgo's nanny, she's Murgo's meal, the final offering of this particular iteration of the hunt. And if you think about it, this whole dynamic maps perfectly onto Gwyn at the end of Dark Souls 1. If he kills you and you give up, he harvests your souls in order to continue feeding his flame. If you kill him and link the flame, you take his place as the new keeper. And if you side with Koth, then the souls are usurped, and a new flame comes into being. Regardless of which path you end up taking, both Gehrman and Gwyn are just there to preside over a rite of kindling. It's well established that one of the biggest inspirations for Dark Souls is Celtic mythology. Gwyn himself is almost certainly based on a major character in Welsh mythology named Gwyn ap Nuith. One of the places that Gwyn pops up in is the mythos of the Wild Hunt, a story common in various Northern European cultures. In it, a figure such as Gwyn presides over a soul-raving chase that is often accompanied by a catastrophe, like, say, a plague of undead. Some other common leaders of the hunt include Odin for Scandinavian cultures, who hanged himself from a branch of the tree Yggdrasil for 9 days and 9 nights so he might discover runes. Or Wotan, who I guess is just Odin but a bit more German. In the Ring of the Nibelung, Wotan trades away the titular ring to the giants as payment for the building of Valhalla. Honestly, this whole Wagner thing is just a loose thread that I'm definitely not bringing up as any kind of foreshadowing. I'm not even sure why I kept it in the script. Ultimately, both Dark Souls and Bloodborne are at their core wild hunts, and you're just a simple hunting dog. Though, I suppose a hunting dog capable of being disobedient at the very last moment. But the big question behind the narrative doesn't have anything at all to do with you, the player. It's the question of who the hunt is meant to feed, and why. The title of this video comes from the description of the covetous serpent rings in Dark Souls 1. The serpent is an imperfect dragon and symbol of the undead. Its habit of devouring prey even larger than itself has led to an association with gluttony. Except, the title's actually based on the Fextra Life Wiki description, which uses of instead of with. Sometimes, even a transcription error can be a source of inspiration. Another place where the word covetous shows up in the series is the covetous demon of Dark Souls 2. His soul has the following description. Eating is an expression of desire. There once was a man whose deep affections were unrequited. He transformed into the covetous demon, which only made him lonelier than before. The soul can be traded for the bone scythe, which perhaps continues his story. That thing that ended up as a monstrous fiend, what was it to begin with, and why did it never leave the queen? Perhaps it was entranced by some perversion of love. It's a simple story that could easily be transposed into any number of characters. Gwyn, Gehrman, Willem, Father Ariandel, Aldia, Brame, Lautrec, Manus. But there's a completely different direction we can take this gluttony. In the Dark Souls 1 Design Works interview, when talking about the design process for the Painted World, Miyazaki had this to say. When collaborating with the team, I often come up with ideas, and I enjoy trying to fit them in as we develop the world. Of course, I also have to be careful not to break anything. I think this method of continuous improvement can really help add to the atmosphere of an area. In fact, we also used this method on the last game I worked on, Demon's Souls. The problem is that there is a tendency to overproduce things, and before you know it, the project can spiral out of control and work can slow down. I suppose I'm getting off subject slightly, so I will stop there, but it's something I want to work on in the future. The idea of overproduction is an interesting one. In a way, it's sort of a form of gluttony. A habit of attempting to devour prey that might just be a little too large. This habit of spiraling out of control gets alluded to later in the interview, when talking about the disappointment surrounding the Bed of Chaos. What boss gave you the most trouble? Who gave me the most trouble? All of them, right? That's the truth, haha. There were quite a few when deadlines were closing in and I couldn't get a good mental image of what I wanted, but we had to settle on something. Those situations were the hardest because I knew something was wrong, but couldn't express what I wanted and couldn't give a solution. That was difficult, both for me and for the artists I was working with. I suppose the Bed of Chaos is the principal example of this. I've already talked about quite a few aspects of the game I'm not entirely happy with, but I have to say my greatest regret is the Bed of Chaos. The artists and designers worked extremely hard and came up with some fantastic ideas, but it exposed a real problem in our production method. We have no way to find a common goal and work towards it when things go wrong. It's definitely something I want to correct in the future. It's likely that one of the biggest challenges FromSoft had in the making of Dark Souls was having too many ideas. That when it came time to try to consummate things on the Bed of Chaos, someone had an inconvenient tendency to get stuck in ceaseless discharge. It's a metaphor that certainly puts the orange charred ring in a new light. Hopefully not a black light. So yeah, from this point on things are going to get quite a bit more meta. I know some people aren't going to like that, but this is a series whose director is on record as saying, "Now I'm president, I get to meet a lot of other company presidents. They're such weird people. I'm fascinated by them. I use some of them as enemy characters in our games." I worked on this story for a year, and he tweeted it out. Let's close by returning to where we fought Murgo's wet nurse. If you pay attention to the floor, it's covered in skeletal remains, almost as if it was a feeding trough for the wet nurse herself. Just another man-eater boar the shadows of Yharnam were fattening up. The Nightmare of Mensis also happens to be an area with its own variant of the butchers from Dark Souls 1, and it even has feeding cages. But when you take a look at what those cages are full of, well, just what do you think was being fed?